All right, everybody. Thank you for joining. It's 2:03, so this is when we get started. Everyone, the chat is open and the Q&A is open, so feel free to chime in throughout any part of this process. This is going to be a really, really helpful conversation because there's a lot of madness happening in the world legally. We're just focused on the climate legal stuff right now. We're gonna do other webinars about all the other ones, but I'm super excited to have Stacy here to illuminate us all about what's been going on and what's coming and what she sees companies doing throughout this whole process. Stacy is a partner at Davis Wright Tremaine, where you've been for about a year after about 20 years at Morrison Forster. And you lead the ESG and sustainability practice, or responsible business practice, I think we call it, at DWT. So where I want to start, just so everyone kind of gets to know you briefly, I thought this was interesting that you spent 2 decades at MoFo doing a lot of law related to corporate investigations, embezzlement, self-dealing, insider trading, and then took that basis and moved into the sustainability, climate, ESG legal practice.
Mhm.
Can you kind of share that connection in the way that you see it and what brought you into this particular line of practice?
Yeah, I mean, first off, between Sublime and 20 years at MoFo, you're aging me. Um,
And 1 year at DWT. That's
and
fine.
when you okay, come on, stop. No, my personal background is before law school, I got a master's degree in human rights, right? And then I went to Columbia Law School because they had the best human rights program. So my plan all along was not to be a law firm lawyer. As many, bright-eyed young people leaving law school think that they'll go to a law firm for a couple years, pay off some debt, and then like go work at the UN or something. That was me. What happened was I got out of law school right around when the government started enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I really quickly started spending a lot of time on FCPA investigations, foreign bribery, and um, bribery and corruption like really prop up regimes that are violating human rights, and they're very, interconnected. So for me, doing that kind of work felt adjacent to the things that I really deeply cared about. And then, I had a pretty active pro bono practice focusing on, human rights and civil rights and different things. So over time, I started spending more time, in addition to investigations, which I still do and I love. I started spending more time kind of on proactive risk management, and not just in the corruption space, but sort of across ethics and compliance issues, bringing in subject matter expertise, right? I'm not a subject matter expert in all things compliance, but human rights and climate were always just kind of passions of mine, but they weren't really billable, practices of mine back in the day. But over time, I ended up focusing more on risk assessments and compliance program building and kind of counseling on the day-to-day issues that come up, and that as climate related and then human rights related laws started to proliferate, those things started moving into my practice. So at MoFo, I started and led for, I don't know, more than a decade, the global ethics and compliance practice there. And once ESG kind of took off as a thing that, as a like viable practice area at a firm, I got really involved with the ESG practice there, and I was doing a lot of the kind of ESG compliance side work. And I ended up co-chairing the practice there. So I was a co-chair of the ESG and sustainability practice at MoFo as well. So, it was kind of an interesting evolution. It's also, I feel like this is a very self-serving statement to help me feel better about being at a law firm forever. But I do feel like I've managed to build a really unique practice that's very kind of values aligned for me. Because at the end of the day, like I believe that companies that do well by people and planet are, if done correctly, are going to be more successful and more resilient. And so the fact that like my day-to-day job is really um, helping companies figure out how to do that in a way that um, minimizes litigation and enforcement risk, and hopefully at the end of the day drives shareholder value and builds trust with stakeholders and all of those good things, I feel lucky. So I think that, I have a unique practice as lawyers go. My husband gets upset with me when I call it weird. But
This is
yeah,
good.
so
This is good.
that's the evolution, if you will, of my, kind of how I got to sustainability, which really candidly is a slice of my practice, So I still do a lot of internal investigations and anti-corruption and human rights, and you know,
Yeah.
risk assessment work that's broader than climate.
There's a woman named Allison Taylor who's an NYU professor, and she wrote a book about a year ago called Higher Ground. I'm going to butcher the details of her background, but it's something along the lines of she was a lawyer looking at corrupt practices, doing a lot of work around like the diamond and metals trade around Africa. And her approach to what became ESG is talking about how, well, if you, sure, you can get metals out of the ground really cheap in Africa. And a great way to do that is to have a bunch of slaves, and if a bunch of them die, it's probably okay because it's a cheap way to get metals out of the ground. But if that continues for too long and you are kicked out of a country, or your American buyers stop buying your thing, or a country puts you in prison for doing that,
Hmm.
that price, the discounted metals or whatever, may not be worth the sacrifice that you made. And what we talked about when we did a Beekly together last May or June is that the concept of ESG started as a risk management framework
Hmm.
where it said, here's where some risks show up. Environmental risks show up because if you spew toxins into the Hudson River, like General Electric did in the 90s, you will be penalized for a zillion dollars.
Right.
Social risks show up. Like if you are part of child labor
Hmm.
mispractices like Nike was in the 90s, you might have a lot of costs, and governance underlays all this. But then that ESG framework shifted maybe a little bit as laws structured around this and became popular and unpopular, and woke and unwoke, and some allow it, some don't allow it. I'm hoping you can comment. We're going to talk a lot about the specific laws and California laws and everything else, but I wonder what your experience has been of where this framework or concept of ESG is really valuable and good and the right thing, and the right thing in terms of like helping businesses understand these risks, where it was corrupted either intentionally or not. And then there's a lot of hoopla. I mean, I know a lot of heads of ESG who changed their title to head of sustainability. I'm sure you know a lot of those people too. Like the word is not a good word anymore. I wasn't going to say it, but you did. Uh, and I wonder if it matters or if everyone's wasting time talking about it. How do you think about that?
I mean, it is a little bit of a waste of time to focus on it, but I actually think ESG and its origins, like what it was intended to do, it is a really useful framework. And honestly, you can come up with, like, we rebranded to sustainability and responsible business, which I think captures the same thing, but not as clearly as ESG as it was originally intended, right? Like ESG was a framework, as you noted, to identify, risks that are material to an operations that may not be reflected, on the balance sheet, but in these areas of environmental, social, and governance. And it's actually a very helpful framework. And if you think about the broad range of risks that sort of sit under each of those letters, if you will, it's just a helpful way to think about, what risks in these areas are most likely to be material to an organization. And, I think a lot of things changed or kind of demonized, if you will, that word or that phrase. It's still very useful if you understand what it means, but I think a lot of things happen. So I think there are a lot of, companies and others that sort of overpromised, and made ESG, and even sustainability like start to feel like greenwashing, or like it was synonymous with green.
Across the board, right? We'll be carbon neutral forever. We're going to be net zero by 2025. We're going to have
Yeah,
X percentage of women or minorities or whatever
yeah,
in leadership
exactly.
positions by next week. Like,
Right.
pick your thing. You
And not
say
even those
something.
kinds of promises, but even like down to the, our product is ethically sourced and
Mhm.
sustainable,
Yeah, every
and
number,
like
every
just
little
like
piece of
they're
it. Yeah.
sustainable. Like I don't know. It's so, there's a lot of that. I think that caused people to lose trust in the term.
Yeah.
Obviously also became politicized and became used as a like negative political kind of signal for woke thinking or whatever.
Yeah.
Call it what you will. It's kind of funny because I think the anti-ESG movement is sort of at the end of the day what they're saying is that this is about advancing a woke agenda at the expense of shareholder value. Um, you know, and that's really interesting because ESG is actually about identifying material risks, right? And if done well, ESG, or call it what you will, is going to drive shareholder value. It's going to build more resilient organizations. It's going to
Gotta
have
make sure you
risk
don't get
management.
kicked out of Thailand for making
Yeah,
choices.
exactly. Like the fact that by focusing on, people and planet, you're probably also like doing good or being ethical. That's undoubtedly true, but that's not really what was driving that movement. That movement was about providing investors the information that they needed to be able to assess, the risks that were material to a company and how well they were managing them. And so this is about shareholder value. It's not like contrary to shareholder value. And so that's why, the kind of skewing, I guess, of ESG and what it is unfortunate. I mean, we rebranded to sustainability and responsible business. We still use the word ESG. Um, Partly because so many companies have backed away from using the term, and there's kind of a desire to be consistent with
What's
where
the main question
people.
there, and this is the last one about letters, because I think with most people I wouldn't talk about it with, but with you, there's a legal context here. I see some people who are on this call here who have the ESG title.
Mhm.
Is it worth their time, effort, internal political capital to discuss with their boss changing that title? Or should they just move right
Yeah.
along on ESG because it'll come back and like you changed your title?
Yeah.
Is there a legal concern to, hey, my
No.
job is to give investors information, but if the Florida pension fund finds out that we have an ESG person, they're going to pull out? Like, is that a
No.
legal concern?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think there's a need for like an ESG person to affirmatively go out and try to change their. Part of it was because I had just got here and we were kind of relaunching a practice. So if we were going to change the name at some point, like that was the logical
You just
time to
got it.
do
Yeah.
it. And the other reason I wanted to do it is because I feel as though ESG has become, to a lot of people, kind of synonymous with climate, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of people forget about the S and the G when they're thinking about ESG. It's climate change, it's planet, it's environmental. And I really wanted a name for the practice I was leading that emphasized the S and the G as responsible business. Human rights and governance and risk management and human capital and supply chain and all of these other things that really matter to me that I wanted I guess like a framing of our practice that emphasized that side of things as well. But no, I don't think if your leadership or your investors or your stakeholders are really demanding that you make a change, or if it's causing like a problem for you in some way. But I think as a practical matter, I don't think companies are really materially changing what they're doing when it comes to ESG, and I don't think it's essential to change your name. So it's probably a waste of time unless there's like something really driving um,
Yeah.
the need to do it in a given circumstance.
Perfect. All right. That's the last about letters. Actually, more letters. SB 261. So I'll talk a bit about California. I'm going to work well, to catch everybody up, in case you don't know, SB 261, climate risk disclosure law, had a January 1st deadline. I think November 18th, an injunction was put on it, which basically said, pause, don't disclose. We still have a case outstanding that was brought to the appeals court on January 9th, where they heard arguments and discussed both what the Chamber of Commerce is saying is unconstitutional about this law and what CARB and the California Air and Resources Board says is perfectly fine about this law. Um, I'm going to try to summarize those comments really briefly so we can get to the meat of it, and correct me if I'm summarizing them wrong. CARB's argument for keeping this law is that this is just about disclosure to investors. And I thought the strongest argument was we are not making you make any statement about your opinion on climate change. You could publish a disclosure that says, we do not think, and they gave examples actually of very ESG friendly companies. I think they cited, oh gosh, large tech company, and I'm forgetting its name right now. How ServiceNow. They cited ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a big ESG team, big sustainability team, but they put in their TCFD report, we do not see any material risks from climate change. So CARB said, you don't have to say there are any material risks. You don't even need to use the word climate change. You could just say, we think that this doesn't matter at all to us. And that is perfectly fine. We just want a consistent framework in which people can say that. So we're trying to put information out to the market. I think the argument that was brought against this law is saying that there's too much narrative, too much qualitative information, too many assumptions. And while CARB is saying, no, it's just facts, it's not really just facts because it's how do you think wildfires might develop and where do you think your business will go? And it is beyond the scope of what California or any state has ever asked of a company before. So, question A, did I get that wrong materially? But question B is, can you talk to me about what you think is the strongest point on each side? Because as somebody who wants this law to exist, I actually thought some reasonable points were made by the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm curious how this will all land. So, talking about the A, that I missed that, but B, what do you think is the strength of each argument?
Yeah. I mean, I'm really of two minds because I'm a climate person. Like I think I don't think I don't think necessarily that personally that disclosing your climate risks is necessarily reflective of a political
Yeah,
view. On
totally.
the other hand, I'm also a very pro First Amendment person as well. So it's all really interesting to me academically. Also, I have climate clients that are like hugely committed to climate and have been voluntarily disclosing for years and years and years, and that's great. And then I have other clients that are like, what? Like, why am I being made to do this? This isn't relevant to me. My stakeholders aren't demanding it. I'm not a
No
public.
one's ever asked. I would
Why
have
am I
done it
doing this?
first. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and as an advocate, I'm here to really support my clients and like what's most important and needed for them. Um, so, and I think there are good legal arguments on both sides of it. Did you listen to the?
I did. I watched the YouTube clip, took a couple notes. I thought it was like I learned a lot, and I might try to, as a climate person, I try to keep my climate person stuff out of it because who cares what I think. I tried to take,
Yeah,
especially like I knew I
yeah.
was going to agree with the car argument, but I tried to take the Chamber of Commerce argument as thoughtfully as possible, and thought they made some really good points. I think it'd actually be intellectually interesting to defend the counter argument against this law for a minute because
Mhm.
everyone on here who's either hoping or not hoping or wondering if this law will happen should understand exactly what the reason that it might not happen is
Yeah.
before we get into your predictions of what will happen, which we'll get to the extent you're allowed to share predictions. But yeah, explain the arguments to us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the argument is, well, it's a compelled disclosure argument, right? And the idea is that, you can't, well, first of all, that the disclosures are not tied to like a specific um, transaction or product. They're just kind of general and out there. And that, it does that you can't make these disclosures without expressing an opinion, a protected opinion or viewpoint on climate change. I thought it was interesting that they even made that argument with regard to SB 253 on emissions, right? For example, they said that you can't, because SB 253 is going to require scope three or like value chain emissions reporting, that that it's requiring companies to go out and put pressure on their third parties to lower emissions and provide information, which is also kind of should be protected. That it's not that that is a way of expressing a view on climate change and appropriate policy positions around climate change. So I mean, and predictions or not, like it does seem that the panel found some of those arguments pretty compelling.
Yeah, they seem the main judge seemed pretty open to the arguments from the Chamber of Commerce. And I think the one that did make sense to me is not the stating the opinion one because doesn't seem to me like writing a TCFD report is stating an opinion on climate change. You should say not a material risk, move right along. And that'd be totally acceptable. But the not tied to a transaction does make sense to me. The example that the chamber gave is there's a lot of laws that say you need to put something on your packaging that says whatever, that says nutrition facts or that says what the plastics percentage or at the checkout page, you need to say something because that is the moment a customer may buy something. Same thing, like in an S1, when you're about to go
Yeah.
public, you need to disclose things like risk because that is the moment in which, my grandmother's 401k may be pushed to buy your stock. Here, certainly a private company that's not up for sale anywhere, saying that an investor is going to use this statement to potentially invest, there's no transaction that it's tied to. So
Yeah.
that felt to me like a relatively reasonable counter argument. I don't know if it's strong enough or not strong enough or solvable in other ways. But how did that feel to you? That feel
Yeah.
like the judges seem into it.
The judges seem to find it compelling. I mean, yeah, like I said, academically, I think there's really interesting arguments on both sides. I'm just super curious to see where it lands.
What's your
And then like the downstream impact of that for, various other states that are, considering or in process of potentially, adopting similar laws or requirements. And then like by extension, like the interplay of that with, you know, requirements in other jurisdictions and like how companies end up managing, the kind of competing legal considerations. It's all really interesting.
Yeah. So let's talk about the downstream. And by the way, folks, there's a Q&A and there's chat, so feel free to drop in questions there for Stacy. But we're gonna take two scenarios. Scenario A is this law passes. Scenario B is this law is overturned or whatever the right phrasing is. Let's say scenario A happens and the court comes back tomorrow and says, cool, great, law's constitutional. What happens next, both in the short term, like people need to publish a report tomorrow, or do they have a continued stay of some period of time? And then will there just be continued lawsuits over and over and over again against this law?
I mean, okay. So first off, I don't think we know definitively, but I do believe that the California Air Resources Board is going to give companies a reasonable amount of time post decision to actually publish their reports. I would think that they would give at least the amount of time that remained between when the injunction was issued, which I think was on November 18th, and the January 1st reporting deadline. I can't say for sure that that's going to happen, but that's,
Feels reasonable.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think there's a goal here to like,
Trick anyone.
trick
They're not trying to
anybody or put
benefit.
companies in a terrible position, right?
Yeah.
They seem to be, um, wanting to make this at least in the first year, somewhat easier on businesses. At least that's the messaging that we're getting at all of the public workshops. Um, so there's that. On the second question of whether lawsuits are likely to continue, I mean, it's really hard to say without having the regulations, right? I mean, to the extent that there's not sufficient clarity in a regulation, or if parties feel that the regulation comes out in a way that's inconsistent with the enabling statute, you could see litigation around that. And then further, the regulatory process that's going on right now, they've kind of divided it into this initial regulation that really only governs like the first deadline. It has some definitions, and those are perhaps the most interesting thing because it impacts who's in scope with these laws. But it's really just about like the initial like fee administration and the first deadline for SB 253, right? And they've kind of punted on everything else. They're like, then there would
That,
be a
not having been through
subsequent.
this process before, is that like this has felt like a weird, choppy process. Is this a normal process of creating a new regulation, or
I
is it
mean,
within the framework of that a weird, choppy process?
it certainly feels. I, It feels like it's taking a long time, but in defense of the California Air Resources Board, I mean, I also think that they are really wanting to get to figure this out and get it right and hopefully put out something that's not, from their perspective, put out something fundamentally that's not, either lacking sufficient clarity or, susceptible to significant
Yeah.
challenges. So, um, but I do, is there a possibility that there continues to be like litigation after litigation? Yes. And sadly, I think there's also a possibility that these first regulations are going to come out and there are still companies that won't be clear on whether they're covered. And that's just a really, really interesting
Yeah.
thing, I think, and really challenging. I mean, you'd be surprised um, how many companies are like, one word change or
Yeah.
like how a particular
And the doing
word is going to
business
be
in and the dollar
interpreted.
amount. Yeah.
Yeah, like what's financial or pecuniary gain mean? Like what, these things are can really move the needle on whether a company is in scope or not in scope. And for some companies, doesn't matter. They're already voluntarily
Yeah.
reporting, and for other companies, this is not something that they feel is, material or a good use of their resources. And so it's just yes. Could we have continued if the question is, could we continue to have like, a lack of clarity around what's going to ultimately happen? Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
So
someone commented here anonymously, the idea that we all have to hunt for a sentence in a slide from a workshop and then try to decide whether or not to hook our compliance on that is wild, in all caps, wild. I think that's fair. Like the amount of certainly before the most recent set of rules came out, like the amount of, oh, what is doing business in? Well, how many employees do I have? Well, how exactly much money do I make? Well, like we are closing that office and we're at like we were over 500 million a year ago, but last year we actually had a really bad year, so we're below it, or we like the reverse. All really confusing. I'm curious now. So we talked about if this law is passed by the court or held up, probably or supported, whatever the right phrasing is. There are probably more lawsuits, but whatever. Card one, they say, great. Now everyone has 6 more weeks or 3 more months or whatever. Get your report in. Um, Now, if the reverse happens, if the court comes out and says, no, we think this law is unconstitutional as written, what happens inside of California? Like, does it just go away forever, or does CARB have 3 months to rewrite it? Like, what are the logistics of what happens in California and in CARB? And what happens downstream to all these other states? I think New York being the furthest along, that has a bill that is the exact same thing as this SB 261 law, but doing business in New York. Do they take that, learn from it, and adjust it? Do they kill it because they don't want to have this fight? Do they get after it again? Like, do they change it? How does both those things work? What happens in California and then what happens in other states?
right. I mean, okay, I don't think everything's going to disappear. Like, we have different circuits. We have, like, I just don't think, I think that the states that want to be bold on this, particularly in the absence of federal action here, are going to continue to want to be bold on it, right? I also think that regardless of how this Ninth Circuit decision comes out, it's probably going to be, it's probably not going to be the end of the fight, whether there's, a rehearing on bonk or, a petition for cert, whether it's ultimately, taken up by the Supreme Court or not. All of that remains to be seen, but I definitely don't think it's, pack up and go away. So I don't know. I don't know what will happen, but it feels to me that these, we're going to have the pendulum has swung in a particular way as it relates to, public opinion about ESG, maybe. If you can even call like the anti-ESG stuff indicative of public opinion, right? But pendulums are going to swing back. I don't think climate change is going anywhere. I don't know what you think. And so and we're seeing the proliferation of climate disclosure requirements in all sorts of spaces, in addition to the fact that, investors, um, investors are going to continue to demand it. So counterparties and clients are going to continue are going to demand it. So ultimately, my guess is that ultimately, at some point, many companies, not all, are going to find that they're reporting on climate risk. I could totally be wrong about that, but that's my gut on it. And so it's really a question of, because who made them do it, or and when, then like a whether. That's my guess. That's my best guess. But yeah, it's. I also agree with the comment that was just made. It's like there's this whole theoretical, whatever, academic discussion that we could have about like disclosure versus action, right? And what's really moving the needle when it comes to climate change? Is it the resources that are being spent on like drafting reports and disclosures, which candidly, often may reflect what companies are doing. And so, and investors and stakeholders want to see them. But, if companies have limited resources and they're spending their time and resources on a report rather than on like making meaningful changes that actually, so there's, it's interesting. There's a lot of academic
Spending time on
discussions
the
we could have.
report is even worse, or is even not as so bad as spending time on tracking a law and answering your boss's questions about, hey, what's the latest on this law? Like, at least if you're spending your time on a disclosure, certainly with a bunch of tools and AI and whatever available now to speed that stuff up, you can make the argument, well, you're spending time showing the market that people care about it or teaching investors what you're doing about it, and that does up your stock price if they feel like you're more resilient or you have a good plan or whatever. Communication is sometimes the action that you need to take. Um, but the watching the back and forth is super frustrating. Do you
Yeah.
th- do you think? But I want to ask you again, like very specifically, if you were the I don't even know who does the Attorney General Council of New York or whatever, the Attorney General of New York, um, and you see CARB get like lose this case, and you have your bill, or maybe it's a senator who sponsored it, whoever you would be in my that metaphor here. Like, what do you do? Do you just push forward with your bill and say, now it's our turn? Do you take it back to the drafting board, take another 2 years, and then move forward? Like what actually could happen inside of the mind of a passionate, embodied politician in the state of New York?
I mean, either of those things could happen. I think what's unlikely to happen, not if I'm me, but if I'm the impassioned regulator, I think what's unlikely to happen is for them to just to drop it entirely. I could be wrong, and there's obviously all sorts of politics here as well, right?
Mhm.
And so, and changing administrations and all sorts of different things that can happen in the interim. But um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
what they'll do. I don't have a
Yeah.
good.
But your point is they're not going to say, oh, well, that one didn't work out.
I
Let's
think
move.
it's unlikely. I don't know. Maybe it's
Yeah.
possible that other states are like, okay, we don't want to deal with this. Like, look what California just went through, and look at all of the resources that the state expended, and then look what came out of that. And like this isn't the moment in time where we want to be focused on this. We have other priorities. I don't know. It's certainly possible. But it's certainly hard to predict as well.
What are some of the most common questions your clients are coming to you with regarding this thing beyond, hey, any update? I'm sure there's
Yeah.
plenty.
You mean other than, am I covered?
Yeah, yeah. Am I covered? Is there any update? Am
What
I
if,
covered
yeah,
thing?
to the point of the anonymous commenter about the wildness. Yeah, like wait, did Carb say any sentence that actually
Yeah.
clarifies for me that, whether or not I'm in scope? So, there's a lot of that. Lots of questions just around how to prepare for this, like how to keep track of what, jurisdictions and evolving legal requirements are up, going to apply to them and under what circumstances and what it means and when do they take effect. I mean, for some companies, like big global companies with like subsidiaries all over and operations in a lot of jurisdictions, like this is becoming a legitimate mapping exercise, right? And it's not just the disclosure requirements, it's like the due diligence requirements as well. So, what, what they're going to have to do to satisfy, this jurisdiction and that jurisdiction, and then like, what's their approach if they've got differing requirements in different jurisdictions? How do they handle that? So there's there's a lot going on, and then there's the whole question of if at this particular moment in time we don't have to do anything under any law, what do we do? You know? So there's a lot going on. And like I said before, I mean, I don't know, I have somewhere between 30 and 40 clients that I'm like sustainability counseling, disclosure. Um, and they vary so dramatically, in terms of their sizes, their resources, like their risk, the jurisdictions that, they're potentially subject to. And the sophistication of their existing teams and, disclosure history. And compliance programs and all of the things. So it's an interesting moment in time, um, to also, for me personally, to be able to be responsive to these very different circumstances, and very different needs. So
Yeah.
it's good to be busy, they say.
That's fair. I know this head of sustainability who once told me that at least part of his job is skimming 5 newsletters a day. So he said, like part of my job is just I gotta know what's going on. I read every single ESG sustainability newsletter, I read Legal Dive, I read ESG Dive, or whatever. I just check them all out and then I move on. Like being on top of it is a part of everybody's job here. A-
And it
as
could be a full-time job. I mean, it's crazy.
I mean,
Just
the context under which you and I met actually was we were thinking about building out a product that tracked laws all over the environmental sustainability related laws all over the world, and then did a bunch of cool AI stuff to say like if you would be subject to that. Cool product. If anyone wants the history of Beehive, I'll tell you why we did not do that. Like that is a big challenge that everybody has, and I think there's I don't know a bunch of other startups who are trying to do just that. But like it is a messy, complicated thing. Which if you are an environmentalist or somebody who cares about corporate responsibility or sustainability, that's not how you want to be spending your time. You want to be doing,
no, you want to be doing.
you
You
want
want to be tracking.
which
Yeah.
is as much as possible is kind of the Beehive pitch of like do the reporting stuff super quickly and then get back to work on the doing stuff. How much do you follow, probably a lot for your large clients, but global regulations, CSRD in Australia,
I
and
do.
as California is up and down, and companies are trying to figure out what they're doing there, what's been the narrative around? I've been hearing Australia and AASB or AFRS or whatever they call it a lot more than I ever have before. I think CSRD, watered down or not, or omnibus or not, which was the last Green Biz, which was almost a year ago. The big narrative was omnibus. Omnibus came out right or was announced or whatever right before Green Biz last year. I've heard a little less about it now. Maybe it's just been around, but like if you are a large enough company, that deadline of 28 is getting closer. And so everyone's moving their way towards it. But what has been the narrative that you've either been hearing from clients around international law and how it affects American companies or have been telling to clients?
I mean, so there's the growing, international legal regime, and there's the EU, right? Like, I I think it's fair to say that there's been a coalescing around, you know, ISSB, IFRS, um, TCFD, and then there's the EU. So that's
What do are
even.
they just are they trying to do things differently? What do you
Yeah,
mean?
I mean, even post omnibus, right? I mean, and fundamentally, I think the most fundamental difference is just, we started off talking about like what ESG was and, risks that are material to organizations. In the EU, we have double materiality. Okay. And that's like a meaningful difference, because it's not just what is material to what is financially material to a company. It is what is the company's impact, material impacts on people and planet. And since that's kind of the baseline, that is sort of fundamentally different. And I think it can create some tension around, responding to, I guess, like fiduciary duty related arguments for US public companies, and like the things that they're doing should be material, should be driving shareholder value, is double materiality, um, contrary to that concept. But there's a challenge in terms of, for most geographies, I think if have your eye on IFRS 2 and TCFD, like you're going to be pretty prepared for most of like what's coming out so far, right? Except for CSRD. And
That
so,
requires so much more than just ISSB aligned stuff between double material.
yeah, I mean, there's more disclosures requirement, more detail, more specific. You've got double materiality that's kind of forming the basis of what you disclose. It's just different. And so,
put on your crystal ball hat or whatever? Like fast forward, does the EU simplify the requirements, or does the rest of the world increase the requirements to match the EU? Or 10 years from now, just those different countries got different laws?
I mean, I don't, even post omnibus, that there's still these differences, right? Maybe they've become somewhat lessened, but they're still different. Um, and I don't see the EU moving away from that, and I don't see, other jurisdictions um, necessarily moving toward that. So I think there's probably, a period of time where if you're giant, the question is going to be, and the maybe the biggest and most material change to use the with the post omnibus is who is in scope. And so for these giant companies that have significant operations in the EU, like they just may have to grapple with the add-ons of the EU's disclosure regime, as opposed to companies that aren't in scope that I think will be able to sort of streamline their approach, to remain consistent with where the rest of like global disclosures are kind of coalescing. That's my guess, but there's a lot of tea reading being done here.
I think it's also like as these first disclosures go out, in Australia did its first year, and CSRD did its first year, in California, half did its first year. It'll like people need to iterate, and regulators don't iterate as well as companies, individuals do, but they're gonna have to do their best and figure out where people land. One of the things I kind of understand why it's the case, but I don't know if I think it's good policy. One of the things that really bothers me is that a lot of countries made their disclosures specific only to that country. Meaning you can't use your global risk report to comply with Australia. You need to say, well, here's my risks within Australia. And again, I understand why they did that in Australia specifically. It's run by their version of the SEC. So it's like a financial disclosure for Australian investors. But now I need to redo my risk assessments and rewrite my reports and interview only Australian stakeholders instead of just say, I'm a global business who's doing business in Australia or listed in Australia and covered under your regime. Like, I think that's a really frustrating thing to witness, and not that you or I have any control. But I am curious for your opinion as somebody who's watched a lot of these laws, international standards develop. Am I naive or just like small-minded? And hey, Australia deserves to know the risk specifically to what you do in Australia? Or do you think that's just a mistake of this being a young set of laws, and Australia and Japan and Singapore should accept one, and California should accept one global document that says, I, as a large global company, have this exposure. And Australian investors, if you don't like it, don't invest, don't buy my
I
stock.
mean, it's obviously easier for companies to be able to, especially large companies, to be able to have one report at the parent level, right? Like undoubtedly easier that covers their global operations. And so, from that perspective, it would be nice if that were the case. Do I understand why, Australia is focused on and interested in impacts specifically on Australia? I mean, yeah, it makes sense. Does it create like, a lot of expenditure of resources and, challenges for companies that are required to report there and elsewhere? Yeah. So, I don't I don't know really how to answer your question other than that. But
Your answer is, what can I do about it? Australia,
I'm
Australia is going to Australia.
yeah, I mean it's funny because I talk to people who who aren't those large global companies, right? And who are like, why does California need to know what I'm doing all over the place? Like, why aren't they just asking me for my California specific emissions or my, how like I'm prepared to address climate change in California? Like, why do they want to know everything? I guess one of the things, and this is kind of to my point earlier about having just like clients that are at every state of this journey, like every conceivable state of the journey, is that, there are like, I feel like I'm constantly having these academic discussions about like that vary depending on who I'm talking to, about like what the right or best or most fair, or most reasonable approach is. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, consistency is helpful. Like limiting the amount of resources that companies are spending on legal compliance versus like, materially moving the needle on, their climate risk. That would be helpful too, right? But yeah, I don't know. That's my that's my non-answer for you. Uh,
I want to, unless folks have additional questions, I want to maybe end and look inward into DWT. Y'all are a business. Y'all are subject to these California regulations.
yeah.
I don't actually know. I imagine you may be not large enough to be subject to European or other country regulations, but I'm really not sure. But what has been your guys' approach? Like, what are you focused on as a business? How are you handling the fact that you don't have to report? Are you reporting? How are you thinking about when you should publicize a report, if ever, unless you are forced to? What's been some of the work going on inside of DWT?
Yeah, I mean, well, as you know, we're working with you, which I think has made the actual process of preparing the report like quite easy and streamlined. You didn't pay me to say that, I promise. Um,
You paid me.
for me personally, like I can't speak for the firm, right? But for me personally, like, we are one of my favorite things about this firm is just that we're, super values based and like very you know, uh, I lead our sustainability and responsible business practice. Like, I want us to be operating responsibly as well. I am also a litigator by training. I'm not a big fan of, like we say what we need to say, we say what's meaningful, we say, we do the good things that really drive value and where we can really have impact, and and we don't need to be everywhere and say everything. So I would say that yeah, I mean, we're moving forward, like whether we ultimately have to disclose a climate risk report is it for me a different question than whether I'm happy that we've done the analysis, and
A little bit
that's
more. What would make you happy that you did the analysis, regardless of whether you end up disclosing?
because I think that the one of the things that I really dislike about the proliferation of all of these legal requirements, although they keep me employed, is that it's really taking the focus off of like, I want us to be driven by understanding the way that climate change, impacts our business, impacts our operations. What are our opportunities? How can we leverage the transition? What are the risks to us? How can we be prepared for those risks? I mean, that at the end of the day is what this is about, right?
Mhm.
And so for me, I think going through those kinds of, materiality assessments and risk management exercises, um, and not just unique to climate, but in general, I think that undertaking those kinds of activities and having, good risk management systems and risk mitigation measures and preparedness Um, I just think it's good business, right? It's gonna drive value. It's gonna lead to, hopefully longer term resilience. And so for me, like, that's like the legal requirement may be the near term, impetus to do the thing, right? But I'm glad we're doing it because for me, it's a meaningful exercise. Um, yeah, does
Yeah.
that make sense?
I think so. Makes sense to me. Well, amazing. Stacey, I really appreciate you joining and thank you, everybody. Really quick before folks go, we do this every single week. I'm posting some of the upcoming events we've got coming up. Next week, we're interviewing the VP of Sustainability at Workiva. Shortly after that, I'm doing a BI product deep dive. But then we have amazing interviews coming up with the sustainability leads at Braze, at Lyft, at ChargePoint, at Universal Music Group, at Unity, at Russell Reynolds, at Box. It's a really cool lineup coming up. If you're going to be at GreenBiz in 2 or 3 weeks, come say hi. The whole Beehive team will be there. If you need legal advice, go call Stacy.
And
Um,
also, if anybody, like, I'm following all of the California stuff really closely and I'm preparing like pretty detailed updates. So if that would be helpful for anybody, feel free to reach out.
you guys have like a newsletter or an update list or
Funny that you say that. I'm
oh, you
like,
don't
I am
know?
trying to, in my own way, solve for the like, how is a busy professional supposed to possibly keep track of like the constant news in the space? So I'm thinking about putting out like a monthly bulletin of some sort of like, here's the things you must know.
Yeah,
But we're constantly putting out different content. But in addition to that, I'm sending all of my clients these regular, pretty detailed updates of what's going on, and so, I'm
perfect.
always happy to share.
Well, amazing. Stacy, thank you so much. Enjoy your warm weather in California. Everyone else survive Winter Storm 1 and Winter Storm 2 coming up this weekend. Talk about climate risk. Really appreciate it, Stacy. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We'll talk to
Thank
you soon.
you. Take care.
Bye.